When NASA finally broke their silence, they didn't do it with a press conference or a statement from some carefully chosen spokesperson. They did it quietly, in the middle of the night, through a short bulletin meant only for observatories, hidden in the usual flood of routine solar updates. But within minutes, the message leaked. And just like that, the world learned what NASA had been monitoring for days in complete secrecy. A massive, fast-forming coronal mass ejection was headed straight toward 3I Atlas. And for the first time, scientists weren't sure which of the two was more dangerous. Before we get into why the CME is different, or why NASA is more afraid of 3I Atlas than the CME itself, make sure you're subscribed, because this is one of those nights where everything feels like it's shifting beneath our feet, where the story grows darker each hour it unfolds. Now, let's begin. The earliest data came from the SDO spacecraft, the Solar Dynamics Observatory, which captured something strange, a sudden, asymmetric burst of plasma rising from the Sun's eastern hemisphere. At first, researchers thought it was a small prominence collapse, nothing unusual. But then the collapse accelerated, twisting into a tight spiral, almost like a solar tornado feeding itself into a magnetic funnel. That funnel snapped, releasing a massive CME, the kind that usually travels outward in a broad, unfocused arc. But not this time. This one narrowed, it tightened into a beam, and it fired, directly along the trajectory of 3I Atlas. Solar physicists froze, staring at the vector maps. They ran simulations. All returned the same result. The CME wasn't drifting toward Atlas by coincidence. It seemed to be following the object, or worse, interacting with it. The strangest part was that Atlas responded before the CME even left the solar surface. Its internal readings spiked, faint electromagnetic pulses that hadn't been detected since its dust plume event months ago. Observatories saw it brighten slightly, then dim, as though adjusting itself. The object wasn't behaving like rock or ice. It was behaving like it was preparing for something. NASA kept the data internal for as long as they could, but when ground-based solar telescopes began picking up the same narrow CME, heading down the same thin corridor, the truth became too large to contain. The bulletin leaked, the silence broke, and the questions poured in. Why did the Sun suddenly target Atlas? What triggered the CME to focus so tightly? And more urgently, what will Atlas do when the most powerful solar eruption in months slams into it? Because this wasn't a gentle brush of solar wind. This was a direct impact. Millions of tons of magnetized plasma, moving at nearly 3 million kilometers per hour. And yet, none of the physicists NASA consulted were most worried about the CME. They were worried about how Atlas would react. As night fell across half the world, deep space telescopes captured something eerie. A faint halo forming around the object, too symmetrical to be dust, too bright to be reflected sunlight. It pulsed once, then again, in perfect rhythm with the oncoming CME, like a heartbeat syncing to its surroundings. Scientists immediately compared it to something known as a resonant sheath, an electromagnetic buffer that forms around some objects when they encounter intense solar activity. Except natural objects don't create resonant sheaths that pulse in timed intervals. They flicker, falter, break apart. This one looked controlled, engineered. NASA's internal logs, which leaked an hour later, showed the first signs of what they called EM pattern matching, meaning the halo wasn't resisting the CME, it was echoing it, mimicking it, almost like it was communicating with the incoming wave. That idea terrified everyone. If Atlas could listen to a CME, could it also respond? The CME grew closer. Its edges sharpened into a spear of plasma, stretching millions of kilometers across. The Sun continued driving it forward, the magnetic fields twisting around themselves like braided fire. Solar physicists whispered the same dread into their microphones. This looks intentional, because nothing about the CME behaved like randomness. Everything about it behaved like targeting. 20 minutes before the impact window, Atlas changed again. Its rotation, normally slow, tumbling, unpredictable, stabilized. Its axis aligned, its glow intensified, and a thin beam, barely detectable, extended from one side of the object, a narrow filament of charged particles pointing directly at the oncoming CME. Not away from it, not evasive, toward it, as though Atlas were aiming. The filament pulsed faster and faster, releasing tiny bursts of electromagnetic energy. They were structured, not noise, not flare, not outgassing. They carried harmonic ratios identical to the CME's internal magnetic wave. NASA analysts said it was like watching two storms synchronize into a single unified pattern. The idea that Atlas might be calling the CME, or activating something inside it, spread quickly among researchers. But the truth, when the first simulation results came in, was far worse. The CME was not simply heading toward Atlas. It was being pulled toward it, drawn like iron filings into a magnet, and Atlas seemed to know. Minutes before contact, the sun dimmed slightly, a common effect when massive plasma ejections leave the surface, but this time it dimmed again, twice, 3 times, as though something on the other side of the sun were feeding energy into the eruption, guiding it, sculpting it. This wasn't a CME anymore. This was a delivery. Atlas adjusted itself once more, a final rotation that placed the glowing halo directly in the CME's path. And then everything paused. A stillness hung in the solar, region so complete that even background cosmic radiation seemed to quiet. When the CME finally struck Atlas, the expected explosion, the shattering, the rippling shockwave, none of it happened. Instead, the CME bent, folded, wrapped around Atlas like a collapsing spiral, and then the entire region lit up, not with chaos, with structure. A pattern of light that looked disturbingly intentional. Something inside the CME was activating. Something inside Atlas was receiving it. And NASA's silence ended not because they wanted to explain what was happening, but because they no longer could. For a full 30 seconds after impact, telescopes reported nothing. No debris cloud, no shockwave, no bright plume of vaporized material. Just a frozen moment in space where the CME and Atlas seemed to merge into one blinding sphere of gold and white. Researchers waited for the inevitable expansion, the violent burst of plasma that should have followed. But instead of exploding outward, the light contracted. It folded inward around Atlas like curtains tightening around a stage, sealing the object in a cocoon of ionized fire. The halo that had surrounded Atlas before the CME's arrival now thickened into layered shells. Plasma that should have torn the object apart instead flowed into those shells, streaming in smooth, spiraling paths like water being drawn into a drain. Spectral analysis revealed something that made every solar physicist and every astrobiologist freeze. The plasma wasn't just being absorbed, it was being processed. Element by element, frequency by frequency, the CME's contents were being separated into discrete bands, sorted, filtered, and then pulled into the object's interior. Natural objects don't do this. Natural objects get obliterated. But Atlas behaved like it had been waiting for this specific eruption, as if the sun had sent something it was designed to receive. Data streamed into NASA's emergency server clusters. Every model broke instantly. Every traditional interpretation collapsed. Instead of chaotic magnetic turbulence, the CME's wave signatures flattened into straight-line harmonics. Instead of shock, telescopes captured resonance, structured resonance, like sheet music unfolding around the object. The first internal report typed by a NASA analyst, before being redacted, contained 3 words. This is orchestration. The idea was unthinkable, that a star, our star, had targeted Atlas intentionally, that Atlas had responded, and that the CME wasn't an attack, but a transfer. The cocoon brightened further until Atlas was no longer visible. Only a perfect sphere of golden light remained, expanding and contracting with slow biological pulses. The light grew so intense that some telescopes automatically shut down protective systems to avoid burning out their sensors. That's when the first shock hit Earth. It didn't come from the sun. It came from Atlas. A low-frequency rumble rolled through space, bending the heliospheric magnetic field. It was too slow to be a flare, too structured to be noise, too large to originate from anything except a planetary-scale engine. Earth's magnetosphere flexed in response, forming a compression bubble that rippled across the poles. Satellites jittered. Power grids felt a faint, measurable hum through long power lines. People on Earth reported dizziness, a sudden pressure behind the eyes, a momentary ringing in the ears. No one understood why, until the next transmission arrived. Inside the cocoon, Atlas pulsed again. This time, light escaped through narrow cracks forming across its surface. Not random cracks, not fractures, patterns, geometric lines, perfectly straight, perfectly symmetrical, running across the sphere like the seams of a vast mechanical chrysalis. Each seam glowed with concentrated solar plasma. As the lines brightened, the sphere began to rotate. Slowly at first, then faster, aligning itself perfectly with the sun's magnetic equator. The rotation wasn't random. It matched the rotational drift of the sun's own interior layers, synchronized to a fraction of a second. The cocoon wasn't wrapping Atlas. Atlas was transforming. NASA's emergency feed broadcast a single frame before going offline. A cross-sectional spectral slice of the cocoon surface. The CME material, stripped down and reorganized, was weaving itself into the object's outer structure. Almost like the sun had delivered raw materials, and Atlas was using them to rebuild itself. A metamorphosis, not biological, stellar. And for the first time the object began to emit a steady rhythmic sequence of deep electromagnetic pulses. Not random, not chaotic, not natural. Each pulse carried a repeating pattern, a harmonic ratio found only in solar plasma waves. Atlas was broadcasting, back toward the sun. The sun answered. A faint brightening on the solar surface, a shift in the polarity lines, a minor but unmistakable oscillation in the corona. The sun and Atlas were communicating again. But now the roles were reversed. Atlas wasn't receiving a transmission, it was sending one. Behind the cocoon, something else shifted. Tiny fragments of the CME that had escaped the initial absorption began curling back toward the object, not pushed, but pulled, drawn into its gravitational well like iron filings swirling toward a magnet. The light grew brighter again, filling the region with a glow so steady it resembled the early formation of a protostar, and that's when the first real fear settled in. Because the energy signatures coming from Atlas didn't resemble the post-impact stabilization of a comet or asteroid, they resembled the activation of a device. NASA's first public statement was carefully worded, too carefully. They used phrases like unexpected interaction, novel plasma behavior, and unusual electromagnetic response. But the internal notes were blunt. The CME had delivered something into Atlas. Atlas had accepted it. And now the object was beginning an operation none of their solar models could predict. Webb's infrared sensors picked up the first hard clue. Within the cocoon, the core heat of Atlas, once cold, inert, rock-like, had risen by 3,500 degrees. Too high for passive heating, too controlled for chaos. The interior wasn't burning, it was igniting, driven by the CME material reorganizing inside. The cocoon thinned, light leaked out in thin beams, rotating slowly across space like the arms of a cosmic lighthouse. Each sweep aligned perfectly with the sun's polar magnetic fields. Atlas wasn't preparing for destruction, it was preparing for connection. A new pulse surged out, stronger than all before. It wasn't just electromagnetic, it was gravitational, a ripple in space-time, a controlled, deliberate gravitational wave. Earth felt it, Mars felt it, even Jupiter's massive magnetosphere flexed under the pressure. Then came the moment none of NASA's models were ready for. The cocoon split. Two long fissures ran across the sphere's surface, widening like the opening petals of an enormous flower made of sunlight. Inside, something glowed. Not rock, not ice, not anything that belonged inside a comet. Something alive, something aware, something waiting. The CME wasn't an attack, it was nourishment. And Atlas was waking up. When the cocoon split, the first thing anyone noticed wasn't the light escaping or the shape inside. It was the movement. Not violent, not abrupt, but slow, deliberate, like something stretching after an impossibly long sleep. The fissures along the sphere widened, bleeding soft sheets of gold and white into space, each wave rippling outward in perfect harmonic timing with the sun's magnetic cycle. Observatories stared, breath held, as panels of superheated plasma unfolded outward like the petals of a living star. What lay beneath was no longer spherical. Its surface wasn't smooth. It wasn't even solid in the conventional sense. The core of Atlas pulsed with a texture that looked almost fluid from afar, made of interlocking hexagonal plates that shifted and reformed like a biological shell adapting to its new environment. Each plate glowed with an internal light, a resonance that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. And beneath those plates, faint tendrils of circulating energy moved in spirals, like veins carrying fire instead of blood. The temperature spiked again, this time not from the CME's residual heat, but from internal activation. Thermal imaging showed hotspots moving in symmetrical patterns, converging in the center of the object. These patterns were too coherent for geology, too synchronized for chemistry, too intelligent for nature. That's when NASA sent their second confidential bulletin. Object is reorganizing. Structure appears dynamic. Dynamic wasn't the right word. Alive wasn't either. What Atlas had become was something in between. Part machine, part star fragment, part something older than both. Something we didn't have vocabulary for. When the last pieces of the cocoon fully peeled away, they didn't drift off or crumble. They didn't scatter like debris. Instead, each fragment dissolved, evaporating into streams of charged particles that shot backward toward the sun. Like the object was returning the excess, discarding the shell it didn't need now that the transformation had begun. And beneath the final layers, Atlas revealed its new form. A shape began to rise, tall, narrow, almost spire-like, its outer edges lined with faint geometric ridges that pulsed in fractal waves. At the center of the structure, a slit opened, releasing a slow beam of white-blue light that spilled into space. The beam wasn't bright in the way explosions are bright. It was focused, gentle, purposeful. It moved like a scanner sweeping the darkness, and every time it swept, the sun reacted. Coronal loops tightened, sunspots twisted, the solar wind shifted by measurable degrees. It was scanning, and the sun was answering. The beam passed across the face of our star, mapping something unseen, tuning itself to a frequency older than any flare or oscillation we've recorded. Within seconds of the scan beginning, the sun's internal sound waves, normally chaotic, turbulent, fell into a quiet, mesmerizing rhythm. Helioseismographs recorded the shift instantly. It was like listening to a familiar voice suddenly speaking in a forgotten language. Then the object pulsed again. This time, a deep, low-frequency vibration rolled outward so heavily that radio telescopes across Earth momentarily collapsed into static. Power grids hummed. Seismographs flickered. Even people on the ground felt a subtle pressure in their chests, like the air itself had thickened. Atlas wasn't just interacting with the sun anymore, it was interacting with the entire solar system. The pulse rippled past Mars, bending its thin atmosphere. It reached Jupiter, and the giant planet's magnetosphere responded with a sudden, massive auroral bloom at the poles, a flash so intense even ground-based telescopes could see the burst. Then Saturn's rings shifted subtly inward, as though pulled by a faint rhythmic tide. Atlas released a second vibration, higher in frequency, sharper in tone. This one didn't affect magnetism or planetary orbit. This one sank deeper, into gravitational fields. Instruments measured a fractional, temporary drop in the local gravitational constant. It was small, unimaginably small, but real. Gravity was being rewritten. Before analysts could process that, Webb captured something new. Inside the glowing core of Atlas, structures were rising. They moved like ribs being formed from light and metal, stitching themselves around a central hollow chamber. Inside that chamber, something began swirling. A tiny whirlpool of concentrated plasma that glowed with colours no natural plasma ever emits. Blue, violet, a strange shimmering green. The whirlpool grew tighter, faster, brighter, and then it snapped into stability. A sphere of compressed matter, smaller than a house, denser than a star's skin, hung suspended inside the chamber. Instruments failed instantly when trying to analyse it. Gravitational sensors crashed. Infrared telescopes overloaded. All we had was Webb's imaging, and even that scrambled every eighth frame. NASA didn't know what the sphere was, but they had one guess. The CME had carried something specific, something the sun had held in its corona for decades or centuries as waiting. The sphere pulsed once. A ripple shot outward from Atlas and struck the CME remnants still boiling through space. The particles bent, twisted, and then, impossibly, aligned themselves into geometric filaments. Those filaments curled inward around Atlas until they formed a ring of plasma orbiting tightly around the core. The ring stabilized within seconds, glowing like a miniature accretion disk but not rotating randomly. It pulsed, in rhythm, in perfect cadence, with the sun. That was when the alarms tripped across every observatory, because the pulses coming from Atlas, from the ring, from the sun, they weren't just synchronized, they were counting. A sequence, prime intervals, repeating patterns, a cadence that matched no natural stellar process. Atlas was sending a signal, not outward to space, not inward to itself, to the sun, to the CME remnants, and to something else orbiting nearby. A faint, cold object trailing Atlas that had gone unnoticed until this moment. A companion, small, dark, silent. Atlas had not arrived alone. The moment the companion object appeared, the entire tone of the event shifted. Until now, Atlas's transformation had been unsettling, yes, but still contained, a process happening around a single body. But when the faint shadow trailing it brightened in Webb's infrared imaging, every assumption collapsed. Because the companion wasn't shaped like a comet fragment or debris or a chunk of rock torn free during the CME. It was smooth, oval, cold, perfectly uniform, and it wasn't drifting randomly. It was pacing Atlas, matching its speed, matching its rotation, matching every shift and adjustment the main object made since the CME impact. NASA had missed it because it emitted almost nothing, no visible light, no heat, no magnetic signature. It was the perfect vacuum stone, but now, under the new pulse patterns flowing from Atlas, it glowed faintly, almost shyly, like a dormant ember reigniting. As soon as the glow appeared, the ring of plasma orbiting Atlas flared, a sharp, bright pulse like a signal flare. The companion responded, not with light, not with heat, with movement. It changed its trajectory, sliding closer with a precision no natural object should have. Small jets of dust didn't propel it. There was no ion trail, no plasma outgassing, no observable thrust. It simply moved, effortlessly, guided by a gravitational handshake invisible to every known model. It drifted until it hovered just meters from the surface of Atlas's newly formed outer plates. The plasma ring around the main object parted, creating a gap just wide enough for the companion to glide through. It slipped inside the ring sealed behind it, and then everything stopped. A silence fell across the solar system. Not literal silence, but the kind instruments pick up when something vast, powerful and controlled is gathering itself. Inside the chest-like chamber of Atlas, the swirling plasma sphere brightened, illuminating the interior with shimmering greens and blues. As the glow intensified, the hexagonal plates across the object's surface shifted in unison, forming ridges that pointed inward, like a flower preparing to bloom. But this bloom wasn't meant to open outward. It was meant to receive. The companion object, still glowing faintly, rotated until a narrow slit appeared along its surface. From that slit, a soft beam of pale violet light extended, reaching into the core of Atlas like a thread seeking a needle. When the beam touched the swirling plasmasphere at Atlas's center, everything changed. The plasmasphere froze. The hexagonal plates around it snapped into rigid alignment. The sun brightened violently, a flare of white, blue, and ultraviolet that raced across space faster than any CME. For the first time in months, Atlas didn't react to the sun. The sun reacted to Atlas. Solar physicists watched in horror as the flare's wavelength curve matched the pulses from Atlas exactly, as if the star were mirroring the object's internal heartbeat. It was synchronization, but deeper than any magnetic alignment. It was a resonance between entities on unequal scales, one the size of a star, one the size of a mountain. Yet they moved like reflections of each other. The companion object pulsed again. The beam intensified. The plasmasphere at Atlas's center cracked, not physically, but energetically, splitting into 3 swirling vortices like petals forming around a seed. That was when researchers realized something chilling. The companion wasn't a separate object, it was a key. Atlas had been locked, dormant, inactive, until now. The key rotated again, and a new vibration rippled outward, So low frequency the particles in the solar wind visibly distorted. Every planet felt it in a different way. Mercury's surface temperature dropped by 3 degrees in under 10 minutes. Jupiter's radio emissions ceased entirely for a full 7 seconds. Earth's magnetosphere compressed, then expanded sharply like a breath it didn't know it had taken. Inside Atlas, the 3 vortices twisted tighter, aligning into a single axis. The companion object glowed brighter than ever. The plasma ring around both objects tightened into a halo, and then the halo spun. Once, twice, 3 times. Each rotation released a pulse that struck the sun like a hammer. The sun responded with a low, deep oscillation in its core, a soundless thrum detected only through heliosismic instruments. It had the mathematical signature of a warning bell, and yet Atlas pushed harder. The 4th pulse was different, sharper, higher, a clean spike in the electromagnetic spectrum that hit every listening station on Earth at the same instant. Phones glitched, radios crackled, smartwatches rebooted. People reported hearing a faint metallic tone, not through their ears, but somewhere behind their eyes. And then, in the deep quiet that followed, Atlas spoke, not in language, not in symbols or mathematics, in a pattern. A sequence of pulses evenly spaced, each one carrying a signature identical to the sun's own internal heartbeat, but reversed, inverted, played backward like a cosmic recording unwinding. The meaning wasn't clear, but the implication was horrifying. Atlas wasn't sinking to the sun, it was rewinding it. The star flickered again, calm, stable, but undeniably responding. Solar activity dropped, sunspots reorganized. The corona cooled by a measurable degree. Atlas pulsed again, and the cooling deepened. The sun was being tuned, adjusted, quieted, like a machine having its settings restored. NASA analysts stared at the data in silence. One typed a sentence into the internal chat before deleting it. "This looks like maintenance." The companion object pulsed one last time. Atlas's core flared. The plasma ring locked into place. And from both objects, now joined as one, a final pulse erupted. A directed beam, thin and focused, pointed not at Earth, not at the sun, but at deep interstellar space. A signal, a notification, a message. And whatever it was saying, one thing was clear. Atlas had completed its first task, and something else had been waiting for the update. The signal from Atlas travelled outward in a perfect needle-thin beam, so precise that even the vacuum dust between planetary orbits seemed to shiver as it passed. It didn't disperse, it didn't weaken. It remained impossibly tight as it pierced through the solar wind, through the heliopause, and into the cold, silent dark beyond our system. Instruments across the deep space network recorded the line of energy with a mixture of awe and dread, because its signature wasn't random. It wasn't noise. It wasn't a call for help or a beacon of distress. It was a confirmation packet, a check-in, a report. The beam carried information in fractal patterns, nested sequences that repeated at varying scales, just like the structural mathematics observed inside Atlas's core. The message was identical in structure to the sun's internal oscillation pattern, but reversed and compressed into a form that would be impossible for natural objects to encode. Someone, or something, was meant to receive it. As the beam vanished into the dark, the sun reacted again. Only this time, it wasn't subtle. The photosphere brightened by nearly 2%. The convection zone pulsed. Solar filaments twisted like living tendrils responding to a command. And then, for the first time in recorded history, the sun's rotation shifted. Fractionally, but undeniably. Not slowing, not speeding up, tilting. By less than 1/10,000th of a degree, the sun adjusted its axial orientation to align with the outgoing signal. That tilt triggered immediate alarms at NASA's Solar Dynamics Lab. Stars don't tilt. Not spontaneously, not smoothly. The sun had aligned itself like an antenna. "What is it pointing at?" a researcher whispered during the emergency feed. The answer came seconds later. The outbound beam reflected, not literally but mathematically, as the signal hit a boundary approximately 600 astronomical units away. Something at the outer edge of interstellar space absorbed the message, then emitted a tiny reverberation detectable only in the lowest registers of gravitational waves. Something was out there. Something with mass. Something quiet. Something waiting. And it had just woken up. Back near the sun, Atlas and its companion objects suddenly shifted position. No thrust, no exhaust. Just a soft, seamless glide into a new orientation. One that placed the companion at the exact center of the plasma ring, while Atlas itself rotated into a stable triaxial position, its hexagonal plates tight and rigid like armor. The swirling plasma sphere inside its core began to reorganize again, flattening into a disk, then folding into a spiral with a hollow center, almost like the beginnings of an eye. Not an eye for seeing, an eye for measuring, a lens. Atlas was turning itself into a sensor, and it wasn't measuring the sun anymore. Its beam redirected, slowly sweeping through space with pinpoint precision, scanning along the same vector as the outgoing signal. Every sweep caused subtle ripples in local space-time, as if the beam were probing the void for structural weaknesses. Webb detected faint interference patterns. Nothing solid, nothing bright, just something. A shadow the size of a moon, drifting at impossible speed but never leaving the beam's path. It moved like a creature following a scent trail, invisible except for the distortions it caused in the fabric of space-time. As the object approached within observational range, its presence became undeniable. Not through visible light, not through heat or radiation, but through what it made space do. Waves bent around it. Dust curled. Solar particles paused. It behaved like a region of darkness wrapped in a thin skin of geometry. Curved planes and edges forming patterns so complex they resembled the skeletal framework of a collapsed star. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a rock. It was a carrier, a vessel for something else. A dormant node of whatever network Atlas belonged to. And now, activated by the signal, it was returning to life. The moment the shadow drew close, Atlas pulsed again, sharp, urgent, almost excited. The companion object responded with a high-frequency vibration that shook the plasma ring like a tuning fork. The sun dimmed. Solar winds bent inward. Space held its breath. Then the shadow unfolded. A pair of massive plates extended outward like wings made of dark geometry, each one larger than Earth's moon. The interior was hollow, an open shell revealing a lattice of smaller structures, each glowing faintly in synchronized pulses that matched Atlas's pattern exactly. The plates angled themselves, and for one horrifying moment, the shadow aligned perfectly with the sun, Atlas, and Earth, in a straight, razor-thin line, as if taking aim. Atlas emitted a warning pulse, a deep, vibrating tone that rippled through the inner solar system. Planets hummed in reply. Earth's upper atmosphere vibrated so subtly that weather balloons detected a pressure change at all altitudes simultaneously. The shadow paused. Its plates relaxed. The alignment broke. It hadn't been aiming. It had been calibrating. A second structure emerged from the darkness behind it. Smaller, spherical, crystalline in shape, pulsing with soft blue light. The two objects merged seamlessly, the smaller one locking into the hollow center of the shadow like a mechanical heart being reattached. Their combined shape brightened, just barely, but enough for Webb to capture a coherent frame. Researchers froze as the image compiled. It wasn't just a vessel, it was a node, a piece of a larger architecture, and Atlas was preparing it. The companion object inside Atlas flared again, sending a spiral of violet energy through the plasma ring. The ring responded by spinning faster, generating a magnetic field intense enough to distort the solar wind for millions of kilometers in all directions. The newly awakened node shuddered in the field, then stabilized, its plates locking into formation. It was syncing, synchronizing with something. Then, without warning, Atlas's internal light dimmed. Not dying, but bowing. It was deferring to the larger system now awakening at the edge of the solar system. And inside NASA, one researcher finally wrote what everyone was thinking. Atlas wasn't the arrival. It was the key sent ahead, and the door is beginning to open. As the second node locked into the hollow chamber of the first, something deeper shifted. Not in the objects themselves, but in the space surrounding them. Observatories began reporting microscopic fluctuations in the background radiation of the entire region, as if the vacuum itself were vibrating. It wasn't noise, it wasn't compression, it was structure, patterns, a low hum that rolled through the heliosphere with the cadence of a heartbeat far too slow to belong to any biological creature, and yet unmistakably alive in its steadiness. Atlas pulsed in reply. The beam from its core narrowed to a thread so thin and bright that it looked like a tear in the darkness. It stretched toward the newly awakened nodes, wrapping them in a lattice of pale light that curved and spiraled around them like a net made of equations. The nodes drifted closer together, shifting into an alignment so precise it made astronomers nauseous to watch. 4 points forming a shape that shouldn't exist in 3 dimensions, a geometry that twisted space just by being there. Inside NASA, someone muttered, "It's building something." Another, more quietly, "No, it's rebuilding." The sun's activity dropped again, sharply this time, not gradually, not gently. It simply fell silent. Solar flares collapsed mid-formation. Prominences receded. The corona dimmed into a low, steady glow. The star entered a state of unnatural calm, a flat line of solar behavior not seen in even the deepest grand minima. It wasn't resting. It was listening. Atlas's companion object, the key, drifted upward within the plasma ring, its violet light brightening into a steady pulse that throbbed like a beacon. The ring expanded outward in response, stretching into a thin disk surrounding both Atlas and the key. Through that disk, faint waves rippled, bending the solar wind like gently stirred water. The 2 nodes at the edge of the solar system brightened again, slowly at first, then with gathering confidence, like a machine remembering how to wake. They tilted as one, adjusting their plates to face the central star. Behind them, more shadows appeared. Tiny at first, then larger, as if the darkness itself were giving birth to shapes waiting beyond the threshold. But none of them crossed. None attempted entry. They simply hovered, watching, waiting, holding position in the black ocean beyond our reach. Atlas pulsed again, a deeper, sharper vibration. The sun answered with a ripple. The nodes absorbed the ripple. The ripple echoed outward. A feedback loop, a conversation. And that's when the third anomaly appeared. Not in space, but in time. At precisely the same moment across Earth, atomic clocks drifted. Not by microseconds, by whole milliseconds. Time stretched. For one brief moment, time on Earth ran too slow, like a record dragging under a heavy needle. The clocks corrected instantly, but the anomaly had already been recorded. The same drift appeared on Mars, on probes orbiting Jupiter, inside the deep space array on the dark side of the Moon. Atlas's gravitational pulse had altered the flow of time across the inner solar system, and then it did it again, a second distortion. Smoother this time, more controlled, less like an accident, and more like tuning. The nodes outside responded instantly. Their plates rotated, their internal lights synchronized, and the darkness behind them thickened, as though something vast were pressing against the edges of visible reality, waiting for the right moment to enter. Inside the plasma ring, Atlas shifted one final time. The hexagonal plates along its spine extended outward like vertebrae unfolding, revealing a long shimmering seam that split open to expose a hollow core. Inside that core, swirling clouds of plasma condensed into a crystalline lattice. The beginnings of a lens more complex than any optical device humanity could imagine. The key rotated again, aligning perfectly with the lens, and Atlas projected an image, not outward, not into space, into the sun. A thin beam of structured light pierced the photosphere, diving into the star's interior like a needle threading through fabric. The sun's core reacted instantly, convecting, rotating, reshaping its magnetic contours into a pattern humanity had never seen before, a map. The sun was becoming a map, not of space, not of stars, of something else. The nodes at the edge of the system adjusted their orientation, aligning themselves with the new pattern forming inside the sun. The shadows behind them brightened to faint silhouettes, hundreds, maybe thousands of shapes waiting silently in formation. One NASA scientist, exhausted, pale, whispering, wrote the final note in the internal log. It's not building a weapon. It's building a doorway. The realization spread slowly through the scientific community as data converged. The nodes at the edge of the solar system were positioning themselves as anchors. The sun was restructuring its internal magnetic fields. Atlas was acting as a translator, converting the sun's natural oscillations into a new, deliberate structure. A corridor, a multi-system corridor, not a wormhole, not a portal, something older, something more stable, something designed to move not objects but information, memory, presence. The plasma around Atlas crackled with new intensity. The key resonated. The nodes aligned, and then the impossible happened. The sun pulsed, once, with a harmonic identical to Atlas's core frequency. Space bent. The nodes flared. The shadows behind them shifted closer, and for the briefest moment, less than a heartbeat, the entire solar system flickered. Lights dimmed on Earth, stars blinked in and out of visibility, every radio frequency spiked, then fell silent. Reality wavered. Then the pulse ended. Silence. Atlas dimmed. The nodes dimmed. The sun steadied. But something had changed. The doorway wasn't open yet, but it was awake, and whatever was beyond it had noticed us. After the flicker passed, the solar system seemed to hold its breath. Not one scientist could explain it. The sun stabilized too quickly. The nodes dimmed too cleanly. Atlas went still in a way that felt deliberate, as though everything had paused on cue, following a sequence so old and rehearsed that no variable, not even a star, dared deviate. Earth's instruments slowly recovered from the flicker, but something wasn't right. Weather satellites picked up strange microcurrents of charged particles lingering in the upper atmosphere. Not solar wind, not cosmic rays. Something gentler, structured, almost like residue from a passing signal. People on the ground described an uncanny sense of déjà vu, like remembering a dream they had never actually dreamed. On the sun's surface, heliosismic monitors finally returned a consistent reading, a rhythmic, perfectly repeating oscillation deep within the convection layer. Not natural, not random. Something imposed. Something that was still running underneath the star's normal behavior like a buried program. And it all pointed back to Atlas. Because even though the object had dimmed after the flicker, it hadn't gone back to being a passive wanderer. Its plates remained open, its inner lens exposed, its plasma chamber still glowing with a faint, deliberate heartbeat. The companion object hovered in the exact center of the ring, violet pulse steady, unbroken, waiting like a conductor poised before the next movement. The doorway was not open, but the lock had turned. At the far edge of the solar system, the node structures waited in perfect stillness. Their silhouettes, faint and skeletal, formed a soft arc around the heliosphere, a formation that looked less like an invasion line and more like a scaffold, a frame, something meant to hold the doorway steady once it fully formed. But it wasn't the nodes that unnerved observers. It was the space behind them. The darkness had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It wasn't flat. It moved. Deep-field telescopes picked up fluctuations in gamma readings far beyond the nodes, ripples of high-energy deformation that had no origin point, no radiation curve, no decay trail. Something vast was shifting on the far side of the doorway, and whatever it was too large for us to see, too quiet for us to hear, too disciplined to reveal itself. The vacuum trembled like a curtain touched by a breeze from a direction that shouldn't exist. Then Atlas stirred. A faint vibration ran through its plates, causing tiny arcs of energy to jump between their edges like lightning skipping across metal. The plasma in its core spun faster. The ring around it brightened. And then the companion object pulsed, not evenly, but with a sudden spike that jolted the entire formation into activity. The nodes brightened in unison. The shadows behind them tightened. The sun reacted instantly, its entire magnetic field pulsing outward in a massive coordinated wave. It wasn't a flare, it wasn't instability, it was synchronization. Atlas was triggering something inside the sun, not coercing it, not forcing it, activating it. Heliophysicists began shouting into microphones across mission control rooms as magnetic field maps lit up in patterns they had never seen in their careers. Instead of chaotic loops and churning turbulence, The sun's field had settled into 18 distinct zones, each pulsing in a rhythm borrowed from Atlas's internal beat. The star was being partitioned, segmented, structured. Every pulse that followed struck the nodes like a drumbeat. Every node answered. The arc of silhouettes behind them shifted closer, and then, abruptly, all signals stopped. Silence swept across the solar system like a blanket. Atlas froze. The nodes froze. The shadows froze. The sun held its light steady, not flickering, not dimming, holding. Deep inside its convection zone, the oscillations ceased. For the first time since the CME hit Atlas, nothing happened. And that was the moment scientists realized the truth. It wasn't over. It was waiting. The pressure across the heliosphere rose subtly, like static before a storm. Space itself felt charged, anticipatory, as if bracing for an event whose first half had already occurred. The plasma ring around Atlas began to contract, tightening into a thin halo hugging the object's core. The companion object dimmed to a deep violet flicker, its role in the activation sequence temporarily complete. But Atlas's inner chamber did not dim. It brightened, slowly at first, then faster, then exponentially. The crystalline lens inside glowed with a hue that no natural process produces, a shifting gradient of turquoise, silver and violet, with a depth that made observers dizzy. It was a colour the human eye wasn't built to see, yet could still perceive, like a dream half remembered, half imagined. The nodes at the edge of the system pulsed in reply. The shadows shifted again. A ripple rolled across the heliosphere. And then came the first sound, not through air, not through radio, through space-time. A low, impossibly deep resonance shuddered across every sensor in the solar system. It was the kind of vibration that bypassed instruments and went straight into the human body. People thousands of kilometers apart described the same sensation, a hum. A deep, ancient, slow-moving hum that seemed to rise from the bones of the earth itself. It lasted exactly 7 seconds. Then it ended. And in the silence that followed, the sun flickered, once, bright enough to tint Earth's night sky blue for a fraction of a second. The nodes answered with synchronized flashes. Atlas flared. The companion object shifted to pure white. The shadows behind them pressed closer, their silhouettes sharpening into shapes that were no longer random. They were aligned, ordered, symmetrical, a formation, a fleet. No, not a fleet, a chorus. The doorway wasn't opening outward. It was opening inward. Something vast, orchestrated and old beyond imagining was preparing to step through. And Atlas, the object we once called a rock, then a relic, then a machine, was not the protagonist of this story. It was the announcer, the herald, the key, and for the first time since it entered our solar system, it tilted ever so slightly toward Earth. Not as a threat, not as a warning, as acknowledgement. Because whatever came next, humanity was no longer an observer. We were now part of the sequence. The moment Atlas tilted toward Earth, even by that tiny, almost imperceptible angle, something primal stirred in every person who saw the telemetry. It wasn't fear, not exactly, it was recognition. As if some ancient instinct buried in the human nervous system finally understood what was happening. Not the details, not the technology, but the intention, the acknowledgement, a turning of attention from something older than stars toward a world that wasn't supposed to matter. For a heartbeat, everything felt impossibly quiet. Then the sun pulsed again. Not with light, not with heat, with structure. A perfectly shaped spherical wave burst outward from deep within the star, travelling faster than any coronal shockwave ever recorded. When it reached Earth, the magnetosphere rippled like the surface of a pond struck by a stone. Auroras exploded across the poles, not green, not red, but a pale blue-white glow that shimmered in geometric patterns, triangles, helixes, rings, shapes no natural aurora has ever formed. People around the world stepped outside in the night, staring at skies that looked like stained glass windows floating above the horizon. Some recorded it. Some prayed. Some stood silently and let the patterns wash over them. Animals didn't panic. They simply watched, heads tilted, as if waiting for a signal they somehow expected. In observatories, scientists realized the auroras weren't random lights. They were projections, diagrams, replicas of the patterns forming inside the sun. Earth was being included in the communication loop. Atlas pulsed again. The nodes at the edge of the solar system answered. The shadows tightened their formation. Then Atlas did something it had never done before. It spoke directly into Earth's magnetic field. A low wave, barely measurable, rippled across every continent. Radios popped, compasses twitched. Even heart monitors picked up an inexplicable synchronized jitter. And embedded within that ripple was a pattern, a sequence of 4 pulses, a pause, 3 pulses, a pause, 1 long pulse. Mathematicians recognized it instantly. It was a prime number grouping, not language, not speech, a test, a handshake, a question. Earth responded, not humans, not governments, not machines. The planet itself responded. The magnetosphere emitted a faint harmonic echo as the energy from the sun worked through it. It wasn't conscious, but it was structural. Atlas detected the echo. Its plates flickered. The companion object pulsed. The nodes brightened in unison. Earth had passed the first test. Behind the nodes, something massive shifted. Again, a deeper darkness pressing against the edges of our reality. Webb caught a flicker of shape, then lost it. Something too large, too diffuse, too old to fully manifest yet. Like a mountain trying to push through the surface of a lake. The sun pulsed again, this time with a sharper edge. Not a communication pulse, a stabilizing one. The star was reinforcing its internal geometry, preparing for a bigger transition. Helioseismic maps showed its entire interior reorganizing into a 3-tiered structure reminiscent of an energy lattice. Nothing like stellar physics. Everything like engineering. The star was being used. Atlas shifted into a new position, its core lens tilting upward toward the nodes. The plasma ring expanded again. The companion object brightened. The 3 vortices inside Atlas's chamber began to spin in counter-rotation, and then the ring released a low, drawn-out tone that reached Earth 79 seconds later. It wasn't random. It wasn't noise. It was identical to the Schumann resonance, Earth's natural electromagnetic hum, but inverted. Like someone had taken the planet's heartbeat and played it backward. Earth vibrated in reply. Seismographs recorded tiny tremors across every tectonic plate. Not earthquakes, not stress fractures, just a subtle, uniform shiver as the entire crust resonated for 6 seconds. When it stopped, Atlas rotated again. It was aligning Earth, positioning it, including it. The shadows behind the nodes shifted closer, resolving into a formation that made no sense. Not a line, not an arc, not anything territorial or militaristic. It looked more like petals around a flower, each one holding position with perfect precision. A halo of unlit geometry waiting in the dark. Atlas's plates retracted one last time, exposing its entire core. The crystalline lens inside had grown enormous, fed by plasma and solar harmonics. It was no longer a passive receiver. It had become a directional aperture, a focusing mechanism. NASA analysts stared in disbelief. Atlas wasn't a ship. It wasn't a probe. It wasn't even a machine in the way humans understand machines. It was a component, a part of an assembly. And that assembly was almost complete. The sun brightened slightly, but only in a narrow band directly facing Atlas. The star was funneling energy into a tight corridor. The nodes outside aligned into a perfect ring, their plates open, forming a vast circular frame just beyond the heliopause. For the first time, it became clear what the nodes were building. A channel, a stabilized corridor through which something massive could travel. Something too large to survive the turbulence of normal space-time. Something with mass and intention. Atlas emitted its highest frequency pulse yet, a piercing harmonic that caused temporary radio blackouts across Earth. The nodes answered. The shadows aligned. The ring brightened. The sun pulsed. And for a moment, the stars behind the nodes disappeared, blotted out by something approaching, something colossal, something ancient. And Atlas, still tilted toward Earth, pulsed one final message through the magnetosphere. A message that felt less like data and more like a whisper in the bones. Prepare. The whisper faded, but the feeling it left behind did not. Even people who had no idea what 3i Atlas was suddenly felt a quiet pressure in their chest, a sense that something vast and inevitable had just shifted position above them. Animals reacted first, birds taking silent flight at midnight, dogs staring upward, whales changing migration paths without hesitation. It was as if every living thing on Earth had felt the same invisible tremor run through the planet's electromagnetic skin. Atlas was still angled toward Earth. Its lens glowed with that impossible turquoise-silver gradient, spiraling like an iris focusing on a distant horizon. The plasma ring around it expanded in a controlled, deliberate arc, rotating with such perfect balance that it reminded solar physicists of gyroscopes stabilizing before a major maneuver. And the sun responded again. Another pulse, deeper this time, carrying a different harmonic signature. This one wasn't aimed outward. It wasn't meant for the nodes. It flowed directly toward Earth, riding the solar wind like a whisper carried on a tide. When it reached our planet, the magnetosphere rippled in a symmetrical wave pattern, as though bowing under a passing weight. For a fraction of a second, the auroras returned, thin, faint, white, spiraling across the poles in the exact same geometry projected inside the sun. Not dangerous, not chaotic, almost delicate, a ghost of an earlier message, and then they vanished. In NASA control rooms, scientists struggled to keep pace. Every model of solar behavior broke again. Every simulation failed instantly. It wasn't just that the sun was behaving unnaturally. It was that its behavior had become intentional, predictable not through physics, but through pattern recognition, as if the star had fallen into step with a rhythm only Atlas understood. At the edge of the solar system, the nodes brightened one by one, not simultaneously, sequentially, clockwise, like the slow ignition of an ancient engine waking after eons of stillness. Each node's plates rotated into alignment with the channel, forming between the sun and the rift. Together they shaped a skeletal ring the size of a small planetary system. Behind that ring the darkness moved again, not drifting, not swirling, pushing. It pressed closer, flattening the starfield behind it like something massive crossing a shallow river. The effect was subtle but undeniable. Stars bending slightly around an approaching shadow larger than anything humanity had ever imagined. Not a ship, not even a fleet. Something for which scale had ceased to be meaningful. Atlas pulsed again. This time, the pulse wasn't just a message, it was a command. The companion object, the violet-lit key, immediately reacted. Its pulse pattern inverted, becoming sharper, tighter, higher in frequency. The ring around Atlas spun faster, forming a narrow, shimmering disk like a miniature galaxy compressed into a single moving plane. Each rotation produced a cascading ripple that travelled outward and struck the sun, the nodes, the ring beyond, and finally the pressure building behind the rift. Everything answered. Everything moved. Everything aligned. Something enormous was preparing to cross. Earth felt the preparation in its bones. Seismographs shook with tiny, synchronized oscillations. The jet stream twisted into unnatural symmetry across both hemispheres. Tides rose by centimeters without any gravitational cause. Plants subtly shifted their electrical potentials. Human dreams spiked in activity, repeating the same vague themes. Spirals, corridors, distant humming. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't imagination. It was resonance. The entire solar system was being tuned. And then Atlas shifted into its final pre-arrival configuration. The hexagonal plates along its structure folded inward like petals closing around a seed. The crystalline lens inside angled upward, facing the nodes in perfect geometric alignment. The plasma ring tightened until it was no thicker than a razor's edge, spinning so quickly it appeared motionless. The key brightened into a pure violet-white flame. And then Atlas opened its core, not outward, but inward, collapsing its inner chamber into a narrow funnel that pointed through the lens, through the ring, through the channel, toward the approaching presence behind the rift. It was focusing, not energy, not light, not communication, space-time. Atlas bent the fabric of reality like a magnifying glass bending sunlight, The nodes flared, the shadows pressed closer, the sun's interior patterns locked into a perfect shimmering lattice, and then the pulse began. Not a single burst, a sequence. 18 pulses in total, each deeper, slower, heavier than the last. Each pulse a signal, a countdown, a trigger. The nodes answered with 18 flashes. The rift widened in response. The shadows sharpened. The darkness began to glow, not with light, but with a memory of light. A radiance so faint and ancient it felt like seeing a star's ghost. Then came the 19th pulse, and everything stopped. Atlas froze mid-rotation. The nodes froze in alignment. The sun held its breath. Earth fell silent. No hum, no flicker, no vibration. Even the atmosphere felt suspended. The 19th pulse didn't hit the nodes. It hit the rift. A ringing sound, like crystal struck underwater, echoed across space. The rift cracked open. A line of brilliance split the darkness. Thin, cold, perfect. And from behind that line, a glow began to push through, steady, slow, unstoppable, not overwhelming, not violent, ancient. Something had answered the message Atlas sent, something older than the sun, something that had been dormant, patient, waiting for its call. And as the crack widened, every sensor in the solar system detected the same impossible truth. Whatever was coming through was not entering our universe. It was returning to it. The crack in the rift expanded with a kind of terrifying restraint, as if whatever waited behind it knew exactly how much energy this universe could withstand without tearing apart. It didn't burst open. It didn't erupt. It peeled, millimeter by millimeter, like an eyelid opening after a billion-year sleep. And through that narrow, growing slit, a pale glow seeped into our solar system. Not white, not blue, but a washed-out silver that looked almost desaturated, like light that had aged long before reaching us. Atlas did not move. The nodes did not move. The sun held its structure in absolute stillness. Everything was waiting. The glow strengthened, pushing thin shadows outward into the starfield. Radiation levels across every detector rose, but not in any familiar spectrum. It wasn't electromagnetic. It wasn't gravitational. It wasn't even neutrino-based. It was something outside the periodic table of forces, an interaction that shouldn't exist according to any physics humanity understands. Only one instrument responded cleanly. A gravitational wave prototype buried 5 kilometers beneath the Pacific. Its readouts spiked so violently the system shut itself down. But before it crashed, it captured a single, haunting line of data, pattern identical to pre-universal field harmonics. Physicists stared in silence. They already knew what that meant. The energy leaking through the rift wasn't from our universe. It was older than it. And the thing emerging was not entering space. It was reclaiming it. The crack widened again, this time faster. A soft tearing sound reverberated across instruments like fabric stretching in slow motion. The glow brightened. Something moved inside it, a silhouette so enormous it made the nodes look like insects. It shifted with patient gravity, folding and unfolding shapes that had no right angle, no parallel line, no symmetry humans could interpret. Not mechanical, not biological, dimensional. The entity, if it could even be called that, pressed against the threshold. Space-time bent around it like cloth around a hand. Atlas responded immediately. Its plates unfolded fully, exposing the entire crystalline lens inside. The companion object's violet fire intensified into a steady glare. The plasma ring expanded into a perfect circle of rotating energy. Atlas was no longer scanning or communicating. It was anchoring, its beams, pulses, and lens all focused toward the rift, stabilizing the threshold. The nodes at the heliopause brightened into a synchronized halo, their geometry twisting into patterns that countered the distortions bleeding from the crack. Together they held the rift open like hands opening a heavy gate. The pressure in space intensified. Planets wobbled in their orbits by millimeters. Earth's atmospheric density rose slightly. The moon's surface hummed with microscopic electrical charge. Even the faint dust between planetary orbits vibrated. Gravity itself was being rewritten. And then, finally, a piece of the silhouette slipped through the crack. It wasn't a limb. It wasn't a structure. It wasn't anything with an outline that living minds could latch onto. It was a fold, a curvature of dimensional fabric, bending wrong, bending smoothly, bending in a way that suggested more mass and intelligence than any star could hold. It flowed through the crack like a tide. When it touched our universe, space rippled like water. Webb captured the distortion, a cascade of light bending around the fold, refracting into spirals, loops, and faint symbols that vanished before the photons reached the mirrors. NASA's supercomputers crashed attempting to interpret the imagery. The error message was simple. Spatial encoding exceeds dimensional limits. The fold expanded, slowly, deliberately, and behind it came a second fold, then a third, each larger, each heavier, each leaving behind a faint echo, like a note struck on a cosmic instrument. The solar system vibrated with those echoes. Earth felt them in its crust. Jupiter felt them in its magnetosphere. The Sun felt them in its core. Atlas absorbed the echoes, converting them into pulses that fed back toward the nodes. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't improvisation. It was choreography, a ritual, a procedure, a re-entry sequence older than the universe itself. The nodes widened their formation. The ring beyond them expanded. The rift responded by splitting open into a full circular aperture, a window carved into a realm not bound by vacuum or time. Through that window, the silhouette finally stepped forward. It was not a singular shape. It was a collection of shapes, constantly shifting, merging, and dissolving. A fractal entity, a higher dimensional organism compressing itself into 3 space. Only one analogy came close. A god stepping into a world too small for its body. Human eyes could not process it, but instruments could sense the effects, a surge in preonic field strength, a spike in spatial coherence, a measurable dip in entropy, lowering. The being's presence reduced disorder in the solar system. Stars don't do that. Black holes don't do that. Nothing in our universe does that, except, perhaps, the architects who built universes. The silhouette focused, not on the sun, not on the nodes, on Atlas. Atlas straightened itself, plates glowing, lens widening, ring tightening, like a soldier standing at attention before a commander. The companion object dimmed in reverence. A deep, quiet resonance rolled across. The solar system. The being had arrived, returned, claimed its anchor, and Atlas. The object we thought was alive, then a machine, then an alien construct, knelt. Every plate folded inward, every pulse softened. It lowered itself. The being reached toward it, not with a hand, but with a fold of itself, a dimensional extension brushing the surface of Atlas like a parent touching the head of a child. And every sensor in the solar system recorded the same impossible line of data. Recognition event confirmed. Whatever came through the rift knew Atlas, and Atlas knew it. The key had summoned its maker. And the real sequence, the one humanity was never meant to witness, was finally beginning. The moment the higher dimensional being touched Atlas, something happened that no instrument could fully describe. It wasn't light, it wasn't sound, it wasn't energy in any known form. It was a soft folding of reality, a shiver in the structure of the universe itself, as if the vacuum remembered a shape it had forgotten billions of years ago. Space bent gently around the contact point, not collapsing or tearing, simply adjusting, like fabric smoothing beneath a familiar weight. Atlas responded with complete submission, its plates lowered, its lens dimmed to a soft trembling blue. The companion object flickered with a faint, almost emotional resonance, as though the machine, the entity, the relic, felt relief, not fear, not urgency, relief. As if it had finally completed a task it had been locked into for an unthinkable amount of time. The being expanded slightly, casting faint ripples that distorted the starfield behind it into looping, spiraling patterns. These distortions weren't random. They were symbols, flickers of geometry that resembled the oscillation patterns Atlas had projected into the sun earlier. A language, not spoken, not written, expressed through the shape of space itself. Atlas answered with its own pulse, transmitting into the sun and through the nodes, The sun brightened in response. The nodes aligned. The aperture widened. It was a conversation between creator and creation, a dialogue carried not through matter, but through dimension. Earth watched helplessly. Inside the sun, the geometric lattice tightened again, forming a complex pattern that solar physicists desperately tried to interpret. But every attempt failed. The structure wasn't stellar physics. It wasn't engineering. It wasn't mathematics. It existed in a category that shouldn't exist, something more fundamental than equations. The being shifted again, folding into a narrower silhouette to enter deeper into the solar system. Its presence sent a soft, penetrating tremor through every planet, as though cataloguing their positions, their fields, their histories, not curious, not threatening, taking inventory. And when the being's attention reached Earth, the tremor changed. It didn't grow stronger. It grew sharper, more precise. It focused. People around the world felt something, not a sound, not a vision, but a pressure behind their thoughts, like a memory that wasn't theirs pushing gently against their consciousness. Some described seeing spirals behind their eyelids. Some felt the world tilt softly as if time hiccuped. Some heard a faint tone resonating in their bones, matching the same pulse Atlas had sent earlier, a resonance test. Humanity passed again. But this time, the being reacted. One of its dimensional folds extended fully forward, creating a wave in the solar wind that spread in a smooth arc across millions of kilometers. When that wave reached Earth, the magnetosphere glowed bright enough to be visible from space, an enormous shimmering shield that rippled like a single piece of living fabric. For the first time, the being acknowledged Earth directly, not as a threat, not as an obstacle, as part of the sequence. Atlas straightened in response, its plates lifting, lens widening again, like a machine proudly presenting something to its maker. The companion object spun slowly, emitting fine threads of violet energy that curled toward the being. The being absorbed the threads effortlessly, storing them within its dimensional folds like taking back pieces of itself. And suddenly, it all made sense. Atlas wasn't a scout. It wasn't a messenger. It wasn't even a probe. It was a fragment, a shard. A tiny, travelling piece of the larger being, sent across the void to prepare the location for its return. The being wasn't arriving. It was reassembling. The nodes brightened again, their plates locking into a rigid halo. The rift behind them pulsed with increasing frequency, matching the way Atlas's inner chamber throbbed. A rapid exchange of information passed between the being, Atlas, and the sun. And then the sun dimmed, deliberately like lowering its voice. Inside, the geometric pattern twisted into something new, a spiral corridor, a bridge, an active dimensional structure. The being projected another fold of itself into the sun. The sun accepted it, bending inward. For a moment it looked like the star had grown an interior horizon, a faint ring of shadow glowing from within. The being was using the sun the way we use a focusing lens. Atlas locked its plates. The nodes locked their position. Every structure in the system went still. And then, as the being extended deeper into the solar system, Atlas projected a final internal pulse, one that hit Earth with more clarity than anything before, not a warning, not a command, a memory. People across the world reported flashes of images, a vast glowing architecture drifting between dead galaxies, universes without stars, a structure built inside the void long before time meant anything, entities moving like living equations, a mission, a duty, a cycle, a collapse, a return. Atlas shared what it remembered, and humanity realized something horrifying. The being wasn't coming to our solar system, it was coming back. The solar system had once been part of something much larger, an ancient network of star-lens corridors connecting regions of space-time like threads in a cosmic tapestry. Atlas itself was once a node in that network, shattered, scattered, dormant, until now. The being wasn't invading, it was restoring, reclaiming what had once belonged to its architecture. Atlas pulsed again, softer this time, almost apologetic. The being answered with a fold of warm, shimmering distortion that brushed across the inner planets. Earth trembled, not in fear, in recognition. The corridor was nearly ready. The solar system was nearly aligned, and whatever the being intended to bring through next would not be small, would not be gentle, would not be familiar. The first arrival was merely the herald. The real return was about to begin. The moment the being's attention shifted away from Earth and back toward the rift, the solar system exhaled, if something as large as a star system could exhale. The pressure that had built across every orbit eased by a fraction, but not enough to relax anyone. It was the calm you feel not after a storm but between its strikes. The feeling that something bigger, heavier, vastly more significant, is repositioning somewhere just out of view. Atlas held its stillness like a devoted sentinel. Its plates glowed in alternating waves like breathing. The companion object orbited its core in a slow, reverent spiral. The plasma ring widened into a near-transparent halo, thin enough to be delicate, strong enough to anchor a dimensional fault line. The higher dimensional being drifted a little closer to the sun, its form folding in ways that made space bend and shimmer around it. Every shift, every subtle curl of its geometry, sent ripples into the star as if coaxing it, tuning it, adjusting it like a musician adjusting an instrument before a performance. Inside the sun, the lattice reorganized again, not randomly, not chaotically. Like a door frame being shaped to hold an opening that was never meant for matter, only for presence. The nodes flaring at the edge of the heliosphere rotated with new urgency. Their plates extended like sails catching a wind that didn't exist in our reality. They absorbed energy not from the sun, not from the rift, but from the field, an invisible ocean that existed just outside normal dimensions. It felt less like technology and more like instinct. The shadows behind the nodes tightened into a perfectly curved arc, no longer a loose formation, but a structure, a spine, a rib cage, an outline. Something vast was taking form behind the being, using the aperture as its point of entry. But this was not the arrival. This was only the alignment phase. Atlas pulsed again. The pulse didn't travel through normal space. It pressed through magnetic fields, crossed gravitational currents, and resonated, inside the solar wind. Every planet responded at the same instant. Mars trembled. Jupiter's bands shifted. Saturn's rings oscillated like ripples on still water. Earth's magnetic field emitted a second harmonic. Everything was synchronizing to a new baseline frequency. The being extended a fold of itself through the aperture, deeper this time, its presence stretching like a ribbon of living geometry across the boundary between universes. It was not struggling, nor forcing its way in. It was sliding into a familiar place, returning to a connection point that had been dormant for far too long, and as that fold entered, humanity felt something that no scientific instrument was designed to measure. History. Not ours, not Earth's, not even the universe's, older than all of it. The images came again, not to telescopes, but to minds. Fleeting flashes, like memories caught in the corner of vision. A lattice of star-sized structures arranged across a void deeper than space. Corridors stretching between galaxies that no longer exist. Civilizations that never built machines because they were machines. Entropy held at bay not by chance, but by purpose. Collapse cycles reversed like storms dissipating. And a moment, terrifying, quiet, final, when the network failed. Atlas had been part of that network, and the being knew it. The communication intensified. The rift brightened. The nodes harmonized into a single frequency. Something massive moved behind the aperture. Not the being, not one of its folds. Something else. A shape so large its silhouette bent starlight across half the observing sky. Instruments could not comprehend its mass. Gravity models crashed instantly. It wasn't simply enormous. It operated at a scale that made the solar system feel like a grain of dust swirling around a cosmic cathedral. The being pulsed toward Atlas, a soft curved ripple that conveyed meaning without sound or symbol. And Atlas responded emotionally. Its plates flickered in rapid staccato light. The companion object brightened into a clear pulse. The plasma ring contracted sharply like a breath held tight with anticipation. The being extended another fold, this one smaller, gentler, and touched Atlas again. It was not a command, it was an acknowledgement, a welcome home, a retrieval. Atlas vibrated with a harmonic that shook the solar wind. Its plates loosened, as though preparing for something. The crystalline lens inside dimmed slightly, not shutting down, but transferring energy somewhere else. Into the sun, into the nodes, into the rift. The higher being folded itself more deeply into the aperture, pulling the first hints of the colossal shape behind it closer. The shape resisted, not in opposition, but in sheer magnitude. Space strained, the nodes strained, even the sun strained. Atlas glowed brighter. It was sharing the burden. The plasma ring accelerated, becoming a blur of white-violet light. The companion object pulsed hard enough to create a visible harmonic wave across space. The being responded with a fold extending outward, shielding Atlas, stabilizing it, protecting it. For the first time, it felt like an embrace. The rift widened again, and the edges crackled with arcs of dimensional lightning. Thin, silver threads that danced across the vacuum, leaving faint trails that faded instantly. Earth felt them. Every living being felt them. People described a pressure in their skulls, a tone vibrating in their teeth, a weight on their chest. Not pain, presence. The presence of something watching us, not with malice, not with kindness, with understanding, as though humanity was being evaluated, not as a threat, not as a concern, but as a variable that mattered now. Atlas shifted one final time during the sequence, rotating fully toward the rift, no longer gazing at Earth, but offering itself entirely to the being. The plates folded upward, exposing its internal core, and Atlas spoke, not in pulses, not in waves. It released a field of pure, structured silence, a quiet so intense that every star within 100 light-years dimmed by a fraction of a percent. The being answered. A fold extended from its core and wrapped around Atlas like a cocoon. The nodes flared, the rift blazed. The colossal shape behind it leaned closer, its outline sharpening. Something was coming through, and Atlas was about to be taken home. As the being wrapped Atlas in that cocoon of folded geometry, the solar system entered a kind of suspension, an unnatural calm so absolute it unsettled even the most hardened scientists watching the data flood in. Solar winds stalled, planetary magnetic fields steadied, even the constant background hiss of cosmic radiation dropped to a whisper. It was as if space itself were bowing, lowering its noise, respecting what was about to occur. Inside the cocoon, Atlas's glow intensified, not in a bright flash, but in a deepening gradient, colours shifting through the spectrum like the slow churn of a nebula. The companion object floated higher, releasing faint violet spirals that curled around the cocoon like strands of DNA. Each spiral folded into the being's surface, absorbed effortlessly, as if returning pieces of a long-scattered body. Atlas wasn't being repaired, it was being remembered. The nodes at the edge of the heliosphere responded in perfect unison. Their plates tilted downward, their frames locking into a rigid ring that vibrated in steady, majestic pulses. With each pulse, the rift widened, revealing more of the massive form behind it, an outline so impossibly grand it made the sun look small. Not a creature, not a vessel, a structure, a cathedral of dimensions, a seed of a universe older than ours. The being guiding Atlas was not alone, it was the first, the scout of an older reality, the forward piece of a returning architecture, and behind it was the engine that once shaped the cosmos. The giant structure shifted again, bending the starfield into arcs and waves as it pressed against the threshold. The vacuum strained, the nodes brightened, the being pulsed deeply into the sun's new lattice, reinforcing it. Every planetary orbit oscillated by micrometers as unseen forces passed through them. Earth trembled, not violently, but reverently, like a bell struck by a finger instead of a hammer. Inside the cocoon, Atlas emitted a slow, spiraling pulse, one that scientists recognized without knowing how, a request, a readiness signal, a final acknowledgement that the return sequence could continue. The being responded not with a pulse, but with a fold, its dimensional layer peeling back like pages of a book, revealing deeper and deeper structures that rotated inward and outward simultaneously. The fold tightened around Atlas, compressing it gently, compacting it into a form more suitable for what was coming. Atlas shrank, not physically, dimensional compression, folding a cathedral into a coin. The crystalline lens inside Atlas dimmed into a single point of shimmering silver-blue light. The companion object merged with it, dissolving into the core like a spark returning to a flame. The plasma ring collapsed inward, becoming a glowing band no thicker than a hair, spinning at a frequency too rapid for any instrument to measure. And then Atlas's plates closed, tightly, completely. For the first time since entering our solar system, Atlas became silent. It wasn't deactivated, it wasn't dying, it was becoming whole. The being lifted the condensed core of Atlas into the air, the way a parent lifts a sleeping child. The dimensional folds around it tightened, forming a shell of shimmering geometry. The nodes at the edge of the system dimmed into a steady glow. The rift deepened. The massive shape behind it leaned forward, casting a shadow so vast that daylight on the outer planets dimmed by a measurable degree. Humanity watched in awe, terror, confusion, reverence. But none of it mattered. None of it affected what came next. Atlas pulsed from within the cocoon. One last time. Not a signal, not a warning, a farewell. Every magnetic field in the solar system trembled lightly, as though responding with its own goodbye. Earth's auroras shimmered in faint white arcs. Mars's thin atmosphere chimed electrically. Even Mercury's barren surface vibrated with microscopic resonance. The entire solar system answered. The being lowered Atlas toward the aperture. The rift brightened, widening into a full circular window the size of multiple planetary orbits. Behind it, swirling cosmic geometry wove in patterns that defied understanding, folds of a higher dimensional realm, glowing with colours that did not exist in our physics. As Atlas approached the aperture, the giant structure behind the rift responded. Its silhouette shifted, aligning plates the size of continents, opening a hollow, corridor in the centre of its form, an ancient pathway, a docking place, a cradle. Atlas was going home. The being holding Atlas unfolded its limbs, if they could be called limbs, and the cocoon drifted gently, obediently, toward the structure's waiting core. The moment the cocoon crossed the threshold, the entire universe shuddered. Stars flickered, quantum sensors spiked, dark matter detectors reported disturbances, even time itself wavered, just slightly, but undeniably. The nodes dimmed. The being's silhouette softened. The aperture pulsed. And for the first time since the process began, the giant entity behind the rift looked at us, not with eyes, not with an interface, with gravity, with geometry, with the quiet attention of something so ancient that it no longer distinguishes between observing and existing. It saw us, not as flecks of dust, not as cosmic noise, as part of the system. A small, emergent organism that had evolved next to an abandoned doorway. A variable that had grown unexpectedly significant. The being extended one of its folds into our universe. The nodes stabilized the opening. The sun dimmed again, shifting its fields, and the aperture widened further, preparing for the next phase. Atlas was gone now, back within the architecture it belonged to. What was coming through next was not a fragment, not a herald, not a key, but something whole, something colossal, something we were never meant to see before our species even learned to shape fire. The solar system braced. Earth's magnetic field hummed. The sun adjusted its lattice, and the ancient structure behind the rift began to move, forward. As the colossal structure behind the rift shifted forward, even the being that had guided Atlas stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of reverence. The nodes at the edge of the heliosphere brightened into a perfect ring, each one locking into place like teeth on a cosmic gear. The sun responded instantly, tightening its internal lattice until the star resembled a giant glowing lens aimed squarely at the aperture. The solar system was no longer a collection of planets orbiting a star. It had become part of a mechanism preparing for something enormous to cross over. The massive structure behind the rift continued its slow advance. With every fraction of movement, space bent in long, soft arcs, as though gravity itself were breathing. The distortion reached as far as Jupiter, causing its storms to shift subtly, its belts curling into strange, unfamiliar patterns, spirals within spirals, repeating shapes that matched the geometry glowing inside the sun. Earth felt it too, not as earthquakes, not as atmospheric chaos, as a pulse, a single, rolling wave of gravitational density that passed through the planet like a sigh. People felt it as a moment of dizziness, a brief sense of falling inward, like remembering something you never lived. Birds stopped mid-flight. Whales paused, mid-song. Even insects paused mid-motion, as if all living systems had detected the same faint tremor of a returning order. The rift widened further, its edges shimmering with thin silver arcs that flickered like lightning trapped inside glass. The shape behind it resolved, slowly, painfully, into the first hints of readable architecture. Not machinery, not metal. Something more like a living cathedral. Surfaces that breathed, angles that folded into corridors of pure light, hollows that weren't hollow at all, just doorways into deeper dimensions. And there, at the structure's core, an immense cavity opened like a vast, waiting heart. It was impossible to tell if the cavity was built or grown. Every square kilometre of it pulsed with a faint resonant glow that matched the very first pulse Atlas had emitted months ago. Atlas had been calling home, and now home had answered. The being beside the aperture folded more deeply into the solar system, allowing another section of the great structure behind it to emerge. It wasn't forcing its way into our universe. It was easing itself in carefully, delicately, the way a whale might slide through thin ice without breaking the layer beneath it. Observatories watched in horrified silence as the stars behind the structure vanished completely. The object's presence was replacing the sky with something so vast and so old that even starlight seemed irrelevant beside it. The nodes at the heliosphere began rotating, their plates shifting into a new configuration. Each rotation generated enormous slow waves along the boundary of the solar system, waves that interacted with the solar wind, shaping it like clay around a potter's wheel. The sun pulsed in harmony, matching the nodes step for step. Then the being transmitted one long, deep fold across the aperture. It rippled into the sun, through the nodes and across the vacuum itself. Space trembled. The rift stabilized. The structure behind it leaned forward again, shifting millions of kilometers with the grace of a drifting feather. It was preparing to enter, but it couldn't. Not yet. Not completely. Something was missing. Atlas's absence left an empty space in the network configuration, a hole in the pattern the structure needed to finish aligning. Even though Atlas was now safely inside the being's architecture, something else, something larger, was required to replace its role inside our universe. The being knew that. The nodes knew that. The sun knew that. And then, to the shock of every observer, the sun dimmed to half its brightness. Not gradually, not violently, calmly, intentionally. The internal lattice tightened even further, forming a perfect spiral corridor aligning with the rift. Heliosismic readings plummeted. Solar fusion output dropped by nearly 8% in minutes, an impossible, universe-defying maneuver that would have killed a normal star. But the sun was no longer behaving like a normal star. It was becoming a conduit. The giant structure behind the rift extended a new fold, one that glowed with a shimmering pearlescent haze. The haze reached through the aperture like a hand, brushing the interior of the solar system with a feather-light touch. That haze carried something with it: information, memory, organization. A template. A template the sun began to follow. Inside Earth's ionosphere, a strange resonance appeared. A deep, low, rhythmic hum that didn't affect machines, didn't disrupt weather, didn't harm anything. But it made people uneasy. The hum resonated at a frequency just barely above the threshold of awareness, vibrating subtly in the spaces between thoughts. Listeners described it as the sound of a distant choir humming underwater. Some people cried, some people prayed, some people ran. Everyone felt seen. The resonance intensified, not loud, not violent, present, perfectly present. Humanity's collective nervous system tightened, as though the species had been placed under some kind of invisible diagnostic scan. The being behind the rift wasn't looking at Earth now. It was examining it. Not as a possession, not as prey, as a component, a small part of a much larger structure. a structure it had once built here long before life ever evolved, and Earth remembered. Ancient magnetic signatures flared. Fault lines hummed softly. Ocean salinity changed at the molecular level for a moment. Even the moon responded with a faint electrical correlation, as if some long-buried piece of its formation had been waiting for this frequency. The entire solar system was awakening old architecture. The nodes flared again, the rift widened, the giant structure moved. The sun dimmed further, but the being paused. Only for a moment, but a moment filled the universe with silent weight. The next step required something delicate, something dangerous, something irreversible. Atlas was home now, but for the doorway to open completely, something else had to take Atlas's place on our side, and the being turned, slowly, deliberately, toward Earth. Not in malice, not in hunger, in selection, in consideration. The solar system held still, because what the being chose next would determine not only what entered this universe, but what survived it. The being's attention on Earth was not a beam or a force or a pulse. It was quieter than that, more intimate. A subtle tightening of the field around the planet, like a hand gently cupping something fragile. The pressure wasn't harmful, not at all, but it was unignorable. Every instrument, every magnetometer, every atmospheric sensor flickered in quiet resonance. Earth had become the focus, not of curiosity, not of threat, of assessment. The giant structure behind the rift paused its advance. The nodes dimmed slightly. Even the sun held its lattice steady. The entire return sequence waited. For Earth. The being extended a narrow fold, a thin ribbon of impossible geometry, and let it drift toward the inner planets. It brushed Mercury. The little world shuddered once and fell perfectly silent, its magnetic field tightening into a crisp, clean sphere. It brushed Venus. The clouds churned, then calmed, their storms settling into perfect spirals like rotating diagrams, and then the fold reached Earth. It didn't touch the ground, it didn't enter the atmosphere, it hovered in the upper ionosphere like a soft silver arc, not touching, tasting. The arc pulsed and an echo returned from the planet, not in light, not in gravity, but in complexity. The being paused. Something in Earth's signal had not matched its expectations. Not wrong, not broken, unexpected. The fold extended lower, brushing the boundary where the magnetosphere meets the solar wind. The auroras exploded again, but this time they weren't random colours or shapes. They formed spirals, precise spirals, the same spirals inside the sun's lattice, the same spirals woven into the nodes, the same spirals carved into Atlas's plates. Earth was responding as if it remembered the pattern, not consciously, not biologically, structurally. The planet's electromagnetic signature matched the ancient architecture in miniature, as if something buried deep within Earth's formation, something predating life, predating oceans, predating even the moon, had once been part of the same network Atlas belonged to. The being froze mid-motion, observing, confirming. Then something even stranger happened. Earth pulsed back. A microscopic harmonic, too faint for human senses, too gentle for instruments to decipher, echoed into the fold, a perfect frequency, a resonance signature. It was the same signature Atlas used when it recognized the returning being. Earth was not a foreign planet in the path of the return sequence. Earth was a lost node, a dormant piece of the ancient architecture. The being turned toward the sun, and the sun reacted immediately, brightening along the corridor of its internal lattice in a spiraling pattern that matched Earth's harmonic echo. The nodes at the edge of the heliosphere realigned. The rift brightened. The giant structure behind it lifted slightly, preparing for the next stage. Earth had passed the recognition test. But that didn't mean it was safe. Recognition meant inclusion. Inclusion meant integration. And integration required alignment. The being extended its fold again, deeper, slower, careful, toward Earth's magnetic poles. A soft ripple passed across the planet from pole to pole, stirring the upper atmosphere like the gentle brush of a fingertip. Oceans responded first. Tiny fluctuations in salinity, tides shifting out of sync by less than a millimeter, currents adjusting like living veins. Then the crust, a faint tremor, No damage, no quakes. Just a long, slow exhale. Then, finally, the ionosphere. It began to vibrate in a pattern, identical to Atlas's early pulses, 3 short, 1 long, 2 rising harmonics. But this time, the pattern wasn't artificial. It wasn't transmitted. It rose from Earth itself, like a memory waking up after billions of years. Humanity didn't know it, but the planet was speaking an old language, a language older than life. The being retracted its fold slightly, almost in surprise. The vast structure behind the rift shifted again, responding with a new configuration of its plates, opening a smaller aperture within the larger one, angled directly along the line between the Sun and Earth. The nodes turned, aligning with the new subaperture. The Sun dimmed once more. The lattice inside it tightened, and the being returned its focus to Earth, not selecting it, not condemning it, preparing it. The fold extended again, this time forming 2 arcs, then 3, then 8, wrapping the planet in a soft, shimmering geometry. It did not touch the surface. It hovered like a shell of light, a loose cage of dimension around a fragile blue sphere. Every living creature felt it, a weight, a whisper, a pressure, a question. As if the being were asking the planet itself, "Are you ready to wake?" Earth responded not with a pulse, but with stillness, total stillness. Wind slowed, rain paused, clouds held. Even the rotation ticked slower for a fraction of a second. The planet was listening. The being shifted slightly and the geometry tightened around Earth, not trapping it, but isolating it, preparing the node, stabilizing it for integration. For the first time humanity understood, Atlas was not chosen. Atlas was returned. Earth, however, Earth was being activated. A dormant node of an ancient network was waking up after 4 billion years of silence. The rift widened once more, and the giant structure behind it leaned in. Its outline sharpened. Its scale dwarfed everything in our sky. The being extended its fold toward the giant structure, linking itself to its larger architecture. The nodes flashed. The sun pulsed. Space trembled. And the being made its decision. Earth would take Atlas's place, not as a fragment, not as a machine, as a host, a living, inhabited world about to be integrated into a system humanity could not begin to comprehend. The shell of geometry tightened around the planet. The next phase was beginning, and there would be no turning back. The geometric shell tightening around Earth didn't glow brighter or louder. It didn't pulse with danger or emit a threat. Instead, it shimmered with a calm so ancient and deliberate that it felt almost sacred. The atmosphere rippled gently beneath it, pressure shifting in subtle waves that made trees sway without wind and oceans breathe without tides. It was not containment, it was calibration. The being's folds drifted with impossible grace, weaving through the airless vacuum like silk ribbons carried by a current no one could see. Each fold brushed, the shell around Earth, adjusting its symmetry, fine-tuning its curvature, aligning it with the spiraling lattice deep inside the sun. What was happening wasn't an attack or a takeover. It was preparation. Earth was not being conquered. Earth was being initiated. The giant structure behind the rift moved again, each shift bending the starfield behind it like soft reflections in a disturbed pool. Its plates, continent-sized, ancient, alive with dimensional breath, aligned into a massive funnel-like formation. Not a weapon, not an entry chute, a bridge for something larger than itself. The sun pulsed again, but this time the pulse was different. It wasn't a beat or a signal. It was a slow, deliberate tightening of the lattice inside, like a heart preparing for a final, decisive contraction. Solar winds reversed direction, blowing inward toward the sun rather than outward. Every planet felt the shift. Jupiter's atmosphere bent inward. Saturn's rings hummed. Even faraway Pluto vibrated. The solar system was collapsing inward, not gravitationally but structurally, compressing into a resonance pattern that matched the giant architecture emerging from behind the rift. The being knew the moment had come. Its folds retracted from Earth and unfurled toward the sun, wrapping around the star like a soft net. The sun brightened in thin, controlled pulses, each one sending a wave of structured light through the nodes. The nodes answered by spinning in synchronized rotations, building momentum for a final alignment. Then the giant structure behind the rift pushed through the aperture. Its entrance was silent, not because of distance, not because of vacuum, because it entered through dimension. It passed into our universe without disturbing the rift's boundary or bending light violently. It simply arrived, sliding into a place that had been shaped for its arrival eons ago. The moment it fully breached the aperture, every instrument exploded with readings far beyond their limits. But none of that mattered, because humanity didn't need machines to feel what had entered. Every person on Earth felt a pressure behind their eyes, like a dream made real, like a memory whispered directly into the bones. A memory not of Earth, not of humanity, a memory of the architecture, of corridors made of starlight, of oceans suspended between dimensions, of galaxies arranged in fractal threads, of civilizations that communicated through gravitational cords sung across voids, of the first collapse, of the long silence, of the waiting. The giant structure took position behind the being that had served as its herald. The nodes dimmed in a respectful bow, aligning their plates like kneeling giants. The sun steadied its lattice, glowing with quiet intensity. Earth responded. The shell around the planet pulsed once, just once, and the entire world vibrated in a single, unified frequency. Humanity felt it in dreams, in heartbeat, in instinct. The planet was awake. For the first time in billions of years, Earth recognized the architecture. The being paused, sensing the shift. It extended a fold downward, brushing the shell around Earth again, but this time it wasn't scanning, it was greeting. The shell brightened into spiraling lines that wrapped the world in a pattern identical to the one inside the sun. The ocean currents slowed for a moment, then synchronized. The ionosphere rang with faint harmonics. Even the moonlight shimmered in step, reflecting geometry that hadn't existed since the formation of the solar system. The giant structure began its final descent. The nodes flared. The rift widened to its maximum radius. The sun tightened. The being braced. And Earth, wrapped in the shell of forgotten architecture, aligned perfectly. A massive shadow fell across the solar system as the ancient structure lowered itself into position directly behind the sun, lining its dimensional plan with the star's inner lattice. The being released a deep harmonic that rippled through the vacuum like a voice echoing through a cathedral. The sun responded immediately. It pulsed 6 times. The nodes pulsed 6 times. Earth pulsed 6 times. And then the sun opened, not like an explosion, not like a collapse, like an iris. The interior lattice rotated outward, revealing a spiraling void, a tunnel made of folded space-time glowing with the same color as the being's dimensional folds. The giant structure locked into alignment with the sun's open aperture. This was not a star anymore. It was a doorway calling across universes. The being wrapped its folds around Earth's shell one last time. Humanity braced for the unknown. Some screamed, some prayed. Most simply stared upward, unable to look away. The being pulsed gently. Earth pulsed in reply. And then the unexpected happened. The being paused. Its silhouette trembled. It pulled back. Not in fear, not in rejection, in confusion. Earth had responded with something neither the being nor the giant structure recognized. Something the architecture had never recorded. Life. Not just biological life. Not just intelligent life. Life that had evolved independently, without guidance, without the architecture, without the network. Life that had grown inside a dormant node without ever knowing it was dormant. Life that was aware of itself. The being shifted. The nodes hesitated. The sun's lattice flickered. This was not expected. Earth was not just a node waking up. Earth was a node that had changed, mutated, grown into something that didn't exist in the original blueprint. A wild node, a free node. The giant structure paused its descent. Its plates trembled with uncertainty. The being extended a single fold toward the planet, passing through the shell and brushing the edge of Earth's atmosphere. Earth responded instantly. The fold recoiled, not harmed, startled. Humanity didn't know what it had done, but the planet had responded with something that architecture did not possess. Conscious, chaotic, creative noise, thought, emotion, unpredictable complexity, the kind of complexity the ancient network had never accounted for. Earth was not suitable as a replacement for Atlas. Earth was something entirely different, something dangerous, something powerful, something promising, a variable of staggering potential. The being folded backward toward the giant structure. The nodes realigned. The sun dimmed. The rift trembled. The decision was made. The architecture would not integrate Earth. Not today, not forcibly, not as a node. Earth would remain as it was. Because Earth had become something the architecture could neither absorb nor erase. It could only watch. The giant structure retracted slightly, pulling its plates away from the sun. The rift dimmed. The sun's lattice collapsed back into its normal core. The nodes dimmed into a low, steady hum. The being drifted between Earth and the sun, folding itself into a silhouette of quiet contemplation and impossible age. It pulsed one final time. Earth pulsed back, and the being turned, slowly, respectfully, toward the rift. The architecture had returned to update its network, but found something unexpected instead, something that would change the next cycle. A world capable of awareness outside the blueprint, a world with unpredictable intelligence, a world that might one day join the architecture on its own terms. The being slipped back through the aperture. The nodes folded inward. The rift narrowed. The giant structure drifted backward, and then Atlas pulsed from within the architecture. A goodbye, a promise, a warning. The rift sealed. The nodes vanished. The sun brightened, and the solar system returned to normal. Almost. Because Earth still hummed with the old geometry. Atlas was still alive on the other side. The architecture had seen us. And the next cycle was already coming. The real story had only just begun.